Now begins the famous Joseph story, although as I said earlier, it is really the second half of the Jacob story, even though it focuses on his sons. Jacob experienced the bitter outworkings of blatant parental favoritism in his own life, but despite this, produces the greatest example of it with Joseph. Joseph tells tales on his brothers, and Jacob gives him a fine robe. Nice clothing like this would normally be distinguished by the material, weave, or length. The tradition that it was many-coloured comes from the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew. Joseph's gift with dreams is all too real, but if he had an ounce of maturity or wisdom, he would have kept them to himself. He is almost the youngest of his brothers, and so nearly the most junior, yet his dreams imply that even his father will bow down to him. In a way similar to Mary in Luke's Gospel, Jacob does not dismiss these prophecies. He is right to rebuke Jacob's senseless arrogance, Joseph's, but who knows what the Lord might do. The tensions which existed between Rachel and Leah have spilt over into the relationships of their children. They conspire to murder Joseph, but Reuben saves him. Judah makes a suggestion of selling him into slavery for the equivalent of 2 years' wages. He describes Joseph as our own flesh, another use of that idiom for a close relative. When Jacob is shown the torn and bloodied robe, the word recognized is used to bring us back to Isaac not recognizing Jacob when he pretended to be Esau in chapter 27. Now Jacob is the victim of deception by his sons using another brother's clothes. But even as this family sins and fails, yet all the time God works his greater purpose through them, which will form the climax of this narrative when at last it is revealed. The Joseph story unexpectedly breaks off, and chapter 38 relates an episode about Judah. At first glance, this change might just seem to be for the sake of a fascinating story, but it is in fact one of the character developments of Genesis. Judah featured in the previous chapter, advising the brothers to sell rather than murder Joseph. This was not the same compassion as Reuben displayed. Yet later on in Genesis, it will be Judah who, in a long speech before Joseph in chapter 44, will plead most selflessly to spare Benjamin and his aged father's grief, offering himself in place of Benjamin. A key change in Judah's cold and brutal character takes place here in chapter 38. Judah takes a Canaanite wife, by whom he has produced 2 sons. For the first, he acquires Tamar. But before a son has been produced, is judged by the Lord and dies. No example of his sin is given, but this is not the point of the story. Judah sends in his other son, Onan, to Tamar to produce sons so that there will be someone to inherit from This is known as a Levirate marriage, the details of which are to be found in Deuteronomy 25. This is the law which is the basis for the Sadducees' trick question to Jesus to see what he would say about the resurrection. If a man refused to perform this duty for his brother's wife would accuse him publicly and remove one of his sandals, disgracing him. But here God is sufficiently displeased with Onan to kill him also. Onan was quite happy to perform some of his expected duties, as the text says, whenever he went in. But perhaps Onan anticipated a smaller inheritance were Tamar to conceive. Where does this leave Tamar? Tamar was sent back to her father, but was promised to Judah's youngest son, Shelah. This means that she is not a free woman, and any relationship she might develop would be considered adultery. So Tamar lingers in grief, watching Shelah grow up and not seeing any sign that Judah was going to fulfill his promise. Genesis records that Judah was afraid that Shelah would die too. Convinced that justice was not coming her way, Tamar acts on her wits. Here we have yet another example in Genesis of disguises and people swapping in the pursuit of progeny. As for Judah, he does not seem to have taken his responsibilities in fulfilling the patriarchal promise seriously. He married a Canaanite, and now he does not extend his son's line. But Tamar will right that wrong. First, by putting on a veil and possibly sitting near a Canaanite fertility shrine, Judah thinks she is a prostitute. Cult prostitution in Canaan promoted fertility, and by visiting such a prostitute who was a bride of Baal or El, You honoured the god and secured blessing for your upcoming planting, shearing or lambing. As Judah had gone to that place to shear sheep, this was a well-calculated move by Tamar, although Judah may also have been motivated by more straightforward instincts, his wife having recently died. Whatever the case, Tamar is successful. She conceives, but not before she gets a pledge out of Judah, his signet and cord and walking staff. This is in lieu of a kid from his flock. Unlike with his first pledge, with his son Shelah, Judah is diligent in trying to pay this prostitute. He is unable to locate her, and fearing embarrassment, lets the matter drop. 3 months later, Judah is informed of Tamar's adultery. His reaction is characteristically brutal. Burn her. Why does Judah react like this? The death penalty is possible for adultery, which this technically constitutes, but death by burning in the law, which was to come, was limited to daughters of priests and cases of incest. Why also does Judah not consider his own failure to provide his son for her, and the broader fact that he is also withholding sons from his first son, and that he has an obligation to multiply? We can only guess at his heartless severity, but now Tamar plays her hand. She uses the same word translated as recognize from when the sons show Jacob the bloodied coat, and from when Isaac did not recognize Jacob. In all 3 episodes, there is deception with a change of dress, and goats are involved. Judah acknowledges Tamar's righteousness over his own and admits he should have given her Shelah. Like with his father Jacob and brother Joseph, Judah must have his character refined over the years before he can start properly living up to his calling. We have such dubious, flawed characters in the Bible, but they are all the more valuable for that when they finally begin to start taking God seriously. A final note on Tamar. She gives birth to twins, and as repeatedly occurs in Genesis, it is the younger who is chosen, Perez. 4 women are unusually named in the opening genealogy of Matthew's Gospel, which begins the New Testament story. The first is Tamar, through whom is traced David, the king of Israel.